The envelope was already damp by the time my mother pressed it into my hand, like she'd been holding it too tight for too long, deciding whether to give it to me at all. $500, she said, voice low enough that only Ethan and I could hear it under the chandeliers. I'd asked her quietly, the same way she'd want to be asked, whether she and my father might help us the way they'd helped Chloe. A down payment. A car. Anything that wasn't a check, written to make the asking stop. That's all someone like you deserves, she said. I didn't have time to answer before she turned to Ethan, loud enough now for the 3 couples near the gift table to hear it clearly. Don't expect us to finance another dead end. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that, because I've replayed that moment more times than I can count, and the thing that surprises people most isn't that she said it. It's that I didn't say anything back. I looked at the envelope in my hand, thin enough that I could feel exactly how little was inside it before I'd even opened it, and I turned around and walked out through the ballroom doors into a 110-degree Scottsdale night, past valets, who had no idea they were watching the last 5 minutes of a version of my life I'd spent 31 years trying to earn my way into. Behind me, the string quartet kept playing the same song it had been playing for an hour, and I remember thinking, with a strange clarity that comes right before the shaking starts, that nobody inside that ballroom was going to remember this moment the way I would. To them it was a mother being blunt with a daughter who'd apparently asked for too much. To me it was the last data point in a pattern I'd been refusing to name my entire adult life, finally arriving with enough weight to be undeniable. My name is Lauren Mercer. I'm 31, and 3 weeks before that wedding, I'd closed the marketing campaign that kept my firm's largest regional account, 40% of our entire book of business, from walking to a competitor. Nobody in my family had asked me a single question about it. Not one. My mother had asked Chloe, my younger sister, 40 separate questions about centerpiece linens in the 6 months leading up to that wedding. She had asked me exactly 0 about a campaign that saved 40 jobs, including my own. I want to say I noticed the pattern years earlier and simply tolerated it, but that isn't quite true either. What I actually did was smaller and more damaging than tolerance. I kept trying to earn my way out of it. Every promotion, every account I saved, every year I paid my own bills without help, I treated as evidence. I was quietly building toward a courtroom that was never going to convene. Some part of me genuinely believed that if I just accumulated enough proof, my mother would eventually look at the total and recalculate. I understand now that she'd never once been running the same math I was. She wasn't waiting for evidence. She'd made her decision about who I was before I was old enough to generate any. I stood in the parking lot with Ethan beside me, the envelope still in my hand, and I did the thing I do for a living without meaning to. I ran the numbers. It's a habit from work I've never been able to turn off, not even standing in a 110-degree parking lot in a dress that cost more than the check I was holding. Chloe's wedding. $300,000. Fully financed by our parents, no discussion, no ledger, no version of the conversation I'd just had. My rent that month, $1,100, which I paid entirely on my own, the same way I'd paid for my own college, my own car, every year since I turned 18, and my mother decided, without ever quite saying it out loud, that independence was a virtue reserved for daughters who didn't need to practice it. Someone like you, she'd said. I turned that phrase over the whole drive home, the way I turn over a client's brand history before I ever pitch them anything, looking for the actual claim buried under the language. Someone like me. Not incapable, not lazy, just someone whose worth had already been assigned a number a long time ago. And updating that number had simply never once occurred to her as something worth doing. I'd spent my whole career being good at exactly the thing my mother refused to notice in me. I majored in marketing because I liked the specific discipline of figuring out why people believed what they believed about a brand, a product, a person, and how much of that belief could be changed with the right evidence presented the right way. I took the safe job at a regional insurance firm because my mother approved of steady paychecks and disapproved of anything that sounded like risk, and for 6 years I built campaigns other people got promoted for while quietly becoming the person my director called. Whenever an account was about to walk, I want to be specific about what that job actually looked like, because safe was always my mother's word for it, never mine. I worked 60-hour weeks during renewal season. I learned actuarial language well enough to translate risk pools into messaging a policyholder could actually understand. I built the firm's first digital retention campaign from scratch after our agency lost 11% of its book to a competitor with a better website. And within a year, we'd recovered 9 of those 11 points. None of that made it into a single conversation at my mother's dinner table, because none of it came with a wedding, a ring, or a headline she could repeat to her friends at church. 3 weeks before Chloe's wedding, our biggest regional client, a chain of independent pharmacies, representing 40% of our agency's annual revenue, had 2 weeks left before their contract renewal, and a competitor's offer already on the table. My director handed the account to me on a Tuesday with 4 words: fix it or lose it. I rebuilt their entire brand messaging in 9 days, repositioned them around trust and continuity of care instead of price, and watched the client sign a 3-year renewal instead of walking. My director told the entire floor it was the best save he'd seen in a decade. My mother, when I mentioned it at Sunday dinner 2 days later, asked whether I'd started dating anyone new instead. I didn't say any of that to her the night of the wedding. I've thought about why, standing in that parking lot. I didn't recite the pharmacy account, the retained revenue, the exact math that would have proven her wrong in language. Even she couldn't argue with. The honest answer is that I understood, for the first time completely, that the math had never been the problem. She wasn't unaware of what I was capable of. She had simply never once been curious enough to ask, and no amount of evidence I handed her voluntarily was going to change a lifetime of a hierarchy she'd built on purpose. One favor and one silence at a time, starting long before either of us could remember it. Beginning. Ethan didn't say much on the drive home either. He'd been dating me for 2 years by then, long enough to have sat through exactly this dynamic at 4 family dinners, 3 holidays, and 1 deeply uncomfortable Easter, where my mother had spent 20 minutes describing Chloe's fiancé's law firm bonus, while Ethan's freelance design business went entirely unmentioned. He reached over at a red light and put his hand on mine, not saying anything, which was somehow exactly the right amount of something to say. "You know what the worst part is," I finally said, somewhere past the second red light. "It's not even the money. I don't care about the money." Ethan didn't answer right away, which is one of the things I've always trusted about him. He waits until he actually has something to say instead of filling silence for its own sake. "I know," he said eventually. "I've watched you not care about the money for 2 years. That's not what tonight was about." He was right, and hearing him say it out loud, plainly, without trying to soften it into something more comfortable, was the first moment that night I felt something shift instead of just ache. I opened the envelope once we got back to our apartment, sitting on the edge of our bed still in my dress. $500 exactly, in 20s, folded twice, no card, no note, nothing that acknowledged it was meant for anything specific at all. I thought about the wedding planner. Chloe had been assigned for 11 months. I thought about the $300,000 ballroom, the chandeliers, the car my parents had co-signed for me 4 years earlier because I hadn't had credit built up yet and needed one to get to a job. My mother had picked out for me from a list of things she considered respectable. I laid the 20s out flat on the comforter, one by one, the way I lay out a client's budget before a pitch meeting, and I found myself doing the arithmetic without meaning to. $500 against $300,000, 0% against full financing. A single folded envelope handed over quietly, so the receipts never showed anywhere, against a wedding paid for. So openly, it had its own line item in my father's retirement account statements, which I'd once glimpsed by accident and never mentioned to anyone. I wasn't comparing the money because I wanted it. I was comparing it because for the first time in 31 years I let myself actually calculate what the comparison meant, instead of doing what I'd always done before, which was to look away from the total before it finished adding up. I put the money in a drawer. I didn't spend it. I didn't return it either, not that night. What I did instead was sit down at our kitchen table at 11 o'clock, still in my dress, and open my laptop to the account I'd been co-signed onto for a car. I'd never once been allowed to feel like mine. And I started reading the refinancing terms line by line, the same careful way I read a client's contract before I ever agreed to represent them. I didn't know yet, sitting there, that within 12 hours I would quit the job. My mother had once called safe, refinance that car entirely in my own name, and start packing a life that had never once, in 31 years, been built for anyone's approval but my own. Denver smelled like diesel and wet concrete. The morning we pulled in, U-Haul trailer rattling behind Ethan's 10-year-old sedan, $4,700 between us. After gas and the deposit on a 600-square-foot apartment above a laundromat that ran its dryers until midnight. I remember standing on the sidewalk outside that building at 6 in the morning, breath fogging in the cold, thinking that this was either the beginning of something or the stupidest decision of my entire adult life, and having absolutely no way yet to know which. Ethan carried the mattress up 3 flights alone, because the building had no elevator, and I'd thrown my back out the day before packing boxes in Scottsdale. I remember standing at the bottom of the stairwell listening to him grunt his way up, offering to help and being waved off, and feeling for the first time in weeks something that wasn't dread. It was smaller than hope. It was closer to the specific, stubborn satisfaction of watching 2 people commit to a decision nobody else believed in. The mattress we bought was the cheapest one the store carried, foam that smelled faintly of chemicals for the first 2 weeks, and we slept on it directly on the floor because we hadn't budgeted for a frame. I got the cafe job within 4 days, 6 a.m. Shifts pulling espresso shots for commuters who never once looked up from their phones. My hands smelling like burnt milk by 9 every morning, no matter how many times I washed them. I liked the work more than I expected to. There's a rhythm to it, the same kind of rhythm I used to find in renewal season, except the stakes were a $5 tip instead of a 40% book of business. And some mornings that felt like relief. The cafe's manager, a woman named Priya, who'd run that location for 6 years, clocked within a week that I was overqualified and never once made me feel small about it. She let me take my 15-minute breaks in the back office instead of the floor, so I could answer freelance client emails on my phone, a small kindness that meant more to me that winter than almost anything my own family had offered me in 3 decades. I've thought since about how much of survival during those months came down to strangers, extending exactly the kind of generosity people are supposed to reserve for family, offered freely, without anyone keeping score. Ethan's biggest client, a boutique law firm that had been paying him $4,000 a month for brand and web work, canceled their contract 11 days after we moved, citing budget cuts that turned out, 3 weeks later, to be a lie. They'd hired his replacement's cousin instead. We didn't find that out until much later. What we knew, in the moment, was that $4,000 a month had become zero, and my cafe shifts weren't going to cover rent on their own for long. Ethan didn't tell me right away. I found out because I watched him rework the same homepage, mock up 4 separate times over a single weekend. A project I already knew had been finished and delivered 2 weeks earlier, and I finally asked him directly why he was still touching it. He told me the truth, sitting on the edge of that floor mattress, his jaw tight in the specific way it gets when he's trying to deliver bad news without making it my problem to manage. I watched him apologize for something that wasn't remotely his fault, the same reflex I recognized because I've spent my whole life doing exactly the same thing. I started taking freelance marketing jobs at night, small ones, the kind you find on job boards that pay $80 for a week of social media. Copy nobody reads carefully. I worked at our kitchen table, which was also our only table, under a lamp we'd bought secondhand for $6, typing captions for a dog groomer in Aurora, and a mattress store in Lakewood, while Ethan sat across from me, redesigning logos for clients who mostly disappeared after the first invoice. Some nights we split a can of soup because it was what was left in the cabinet, not because we were being frugal on purpose. And I remember the specific sound our one working spoon made scraping the bottom of that pot, a sound I still hear sometimes when I'm tired. I want to describe the arithmetic of those months, honestly, because it's the part people skip when they tell a comeback story later. We were, by any conventional measure, failing. I missed a credit card payment in our second month there, the first missed payment of my entire adult life, and I sat on the bathroom floor of that apartment for 11 minutes after I got the notification. Not crying exactly, just breathing in a way that didn't feel entirely under my control. Ethan found me there and didn't say anything comforting, because there wasn't anything comforting to say. He just sat down on the tile next to me until my breathing evened out on its own. I kept a small notebook that winter, not for work, just for myself, and I wrote down every specific thing that went wrong the day it happened, mostly because naming it precisely felt more manageable than letting it stay a shapeless dread. Missed payment, the 4th of March. Ethan's contract canceled, the 11th of March. Cafe hours cut for the slow season, the 19th of March. Car registration renewal. We almost couldn't cover the 2nd of April, reading that notebook. Back later, once things had turned, I was struck by how ordinary the entries actually were. Nothing catastrophic happened all at once. It was just a long accumulation of small, exhausting subtractions, the kind that don't make a dramatic story on their own, but wear a person down all the same. My mother texted twice that first month, both times about logistics, whether we'd changed our forwarding address, whether Ethan's family knew we'd moved. Neither text asked how we were doing. I answered both in 3 words or fewer, and didn't mention the missed payment, the soup, the mattress on the floor, or any of the $4,000 a month that had just vanished from our income. I told myself I wasn't hiding it. I understood, sitting on that bathroom floor, that I was. The break came from a place I never would have predicted. A cafe regular named Marisol, who ran a small family restaurant 2 blocks over, that had been losing its weekend crowd to a flashier new place across the street, overheard me on my lunch break, rewriting a caption for the dog groomer, and asked, half joking, whether I did that kind of thing professionally. I said yes before I let myself think about whether it was technically true yet. I walked her restaurant's block myself before I wrote a single word. Twice, once at lunch, and once, on a Friday night, watching who walked past the new place, instead of stopping, listening to what people said to each other outside on the sidewalk, while they decided where to eat. The new competitor had better lighting and a bigger sign. Marisol's restaurant had something they didn't. Her grandmother's recipes, a room that had hosted the same regulars for 11 years, and a story nobody had ever bothered to actually tell anyone outside that neighborhood. I sat with Marisol in her empty dining room one slow Tuesday afternoon and asked her questions nobody, including her own family, had apparently ever asked her directly, where the recipes actually came from. What the restaurant had looked like the year she opened it with nothing but a folding table and her mother's stock pot. Why she'd never once put any of that on a menu or a sign. She teared up twice telling me things she said she'd almost forgotten mattered to anyone outside her own kitchen. I recognized something in that conversation I hadn't expected to recognize. An entire business quietly undervaluing itself, the exact same way I'd spent 31 years undervaluing myself, for almost the exact same reason. Nobody had ever asked. I rebuilt everything around that story. Instead of around price, the same instinct I'd used on the pharmacy account back in Scottsdale. Except this time there was no firm behind me, no director checking my work, no safety net if I got it wrong. I photographed the food myself on a borrowed phone at 6 in the morning before the kitchen got busy, when the light through the front window was still soft. I rewrote the menu descriptions to mention which recipes came from Marisol's grandmother by name. I built a simple weekend promotion around a phrase I wrote on our kitchen table at midnight. The table your family already knows. The campaign cost Marisol almost nothing to run. Weekend sales doubled within 3 weeks. I know the exact number because I built the tracking myself. Checked it every night before bed, the way some people check their bank accounts. Watching a small, local restaurant's reservation count climb back past the competitor, across the street for the first time in months. A woman named Victoria Hale came in for dinner on a Saturday, sat at the counter, and asked Marisol who'd done the new menu design. Victoria had spent 23 years running her own branding consultancy before semi-retiring, and something about the campaign had apparently caught her attention enough to ask a stranger for a name over a bowl of soup she hadn't finished yet. She told me, Later, she'd noticed the framed table tent before she'd even tasted the food. The line about the table. Your family already knows, and had sat there trying to figure out whether a marketing firm or a single freelancer had written it, because the tone was too specific and too unpolished in exactly the right way to have come out of an agency. Marisol gave her my number without asking me first. Victoria called 2 days later, introduced herself, and asked to see everything I'd done for the restaurant, including the pricing I'd charged Marisol for it. I told her the number, feeling smaller saying it out loud than I had felt saying almost anything else that year. $200 for 9 days of work that had doubled a restaurant's weekend revenue. Victoria was quiet on the line. Long enough that I thought she'd hung up. Stop pricing yourself like someone asking for permission, she finally said. Victoria and I met for coffee 3 days later, not at the cafe where I worked, at a small place across town where nobody would recognize me behind the counter. She showed up in a blazer that looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe, and ordered black coffee, no cream, and got straight to the point. In a way I found I trusted immediately. You underpriced that restaurant campaign by roughly 4,000%, she said, sliding a napkin across the table with a number written on it that made my stomach drop the way the envelope had at the wedding, except this time for the opposite reason. A campaign that doubles weekend revenue for a small business is worth somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 minimum, and that's if you're being conservative. You charged $200. I told her I didn't have a portfolio, a company, or a single client who'd pay that. She told me that was a pricing problem, not a talent problem, and that the two were never the same thing, no matter how much they felt like it from the inside. Why does it matter to you? I asked her. What I charge a restaurant 2 blocks from my apartment. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer. Because I spent the first 8 years of my career doing exactly what you're doing right now, she said, underpricing myself into exhaustion. Because some version of asking for what I was worth felt like asking for permission I hadn't earned yet. Somebody finally told me the same thing I'm telling you. I'm just passing it along. I asked her what had changed for her, 8 years in, and she told me the story plainly, without dressing it up. A client had once handed her a check for triple what she'd invoiced, saying he'd have paid it either way, and felt guilty, watching her lowball herself for years, she said. She cried in her car afterward, not from gratitude, but from something closer to grief. Mourning every year she'd spent believing modesty was the same thing as professionalism. Don't take 8 years to learn it, she told me. You clearly don't have 8 years of runway left in that bank account of yours. I went home that night and did something I'd been avoiding for 3 weeks out of a fear I couldn't fully name. I opened a spreadsheet and listed every piece of freelance work I'd done since we'd arrived in Denver, the actual hours against the actual pay, and watched the average hourly rate resolve into a number so low it would have violated minimum wage in most states. I had been treating survival like proof of humility. Sitting at that kitchen table, I understood it had just been proof that I still hadn't unlearned the arithmetic. My mother taught me at that wedding, the one that said someone like me should be grateful for whatever got handed over, however little, however late. Ethan looked over my shoulder at the spreadsheet at one point and went quiet for a long moment before saying gently that he'd been doing the same math about his own rates for weeks and hadn't wanted to say anything, because he didn't want to add pressure to what I was already carrying. We sat there together, going through both our numbers, side by side. 2 people who'd left comfortable well, lit lives for a mattress on a floor, finally admitting out loud that the thing holding us back wasn't talent or effort. It was the exact same inherited instinct to ask for less than the work was worth, just for 2 different reasons wearing the same shape. I registered Mercer & Co. the following Monday, filing the paperwork myself at 6 a.m. before my cafe shift, standing in line at a government office with $11 left in my checking account after the filing fee cleared. The woman behind the counter asked if I wanted the confirmation printed or emailed. I asked for both. I still have the printed copy. It's the first thing I keep in my office now, the one I'll tell you about later, and it's creased down the middle from folding it into my apron pocket that morning, so I could keep working my shift with it against my chest, like something that might disappear if I set it down. I told Priya about it on my break that same day, half expecting her to congratulate me, the way you congratulate someone who's about to quit. Instead, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Took you long enough," which wasn't unkind, just accurate, the way an honest observation from someone who's genuinely on your side usually is. She'd apparently clocked what I was capable of within my first week behind that counter, long before I'd let myself see it clearly. I priced my next project the way Victoria told me to, not the way 18 years of my mother's arithmetic had trained me to. A boutique fitness studio in Cherry Creek needed a full brand repositioning after losing half its membership to a national chain that had opened 2 blocks away. I quoted them $2,800 for a 4-week engagement, more than 10 times what I'd charged Marisol for comparable work. And I sat with my finger over the send button on that proposal for almost 20 minutes before I made myself click it. They accepted the same day. I want to be precise about what changed after that, because it wasn't confidence, arriving all at once like a light switch. It was slower and more mechanical than that. Each client I priced correctly made the next quote slightly easier to send. Each contract I signed built a small callus over the part of me that still flinched at asking for money in exchange for work I already knew was good. By the third client, a family-owned hardware store, fighting the same big box erosion as the fitness studio, I quoted $3,200 without rewriting the number twice first. By the fifth, a regional dental practice group, I quoted $11,000 for a quarter-long engagement and didn't feel my stomach drop at all. The hardware store owner, a soft-spoken man named Ray, who'd inherited the shop from his father, cried a little in his own back office when I showed him the first month's sales numbers. After the repositioning went live, he told me nobody outside his family had ever once bet on that store, the way I apparently had, working nights and weekends on a proposal I hadn't been sure he could even afford. I didn't tell him. I'd once been the kind of person who quietly rewrote her own invoices smaller, so a client wouldn't feel burdened. I just told him the numbers, because by then, I'd finally learned that the numbers were the whole point, and everything else was just the story that helped people trust them. Ethan watched this happen from across our kitchen table, still working through his own comeback more slowly, picking up smaller design contracts while I built something that started, within 4 months, to actually outpace my cafe income. There was a night in May when I did the math out loud, almost by accident, and realized my freelance revenue for that month alone had exceeded 3 months of my old insurance salary combined. I sat with that number for a long time, the way you sit with a diagnosis, trying to decide whether it was good news or something stranger than that. Here is the arithmetic that finally broke something loose in me. The one I hadn't let myself calculate until that spring. My mother had spent $300,000 financing my sister's wedding, without a second thought, framed as an investment in family, in belonging, in a daughter she'd never once had to question. She had spent $500 on me at that same event, framed as a limit, a ceiling, a quiet verdict on exactly how much I was allowed to cost her. What she never once accounted for, what none of that arithmetic had room for, was the version of me that existed entirely outside her ledger, building something with numbers she'd never see and never get to approve. I stopped, sometime that spring, waiting for her to notice. I noticed the moment it happened the same clinical way. I noticed a campaign's metrics finally level off after weeks of testing. I was standing in the shower one morning, running through a pitch deck in my head for a new client, and I realized I hadn't rehearsed a single imaginary conversation with my mother in almost 6 weeks. For 31 years, I had kept a version of her in my head that I was constantly trying to persuade, updating my case for her benefit, even when she wasn't in the room, wasn't on the phone, wasn't anywhere near the actual decisions I was making. That version of her had simply gone quiet, replaced by client deadlines and payroll math, and the specific, unglamorous satisfaction of watching a small business's numbers move because of work I'd built with my own hands. I understood, standing in that shower with the water going cold, that I had spent 3 decades trying to become someone my mother would finally recognize as worth investing in, and that the exact week I stopped trying was the same week I finally became someone worth investing in. Not because the effort changed. Because I redirected all of it toward people who actually asked to see it. I called Diane, one of the first women I'd hired that spring to help manage the growing client load, into my kitchen table office one afternoon, and heard myself explaining a pricing decision with a confidence I didn't recognize as my own voice until it was already out of my mouth. She nodded, took notes, never once questioned whether I knew what I was talking about. It struck me afterward how strange it was that a 24-year-old employee I'd known for 6 weeks extended me more baseline professional respect in a single meeting than my own mother had extended me in 3 decades. By the end of that first year, Mercer & Co. had 12 retained clients, 3 of them referred by other clients rather than found cold, and a waitlist I hadn't built on purpose, but had somehow accumulated anyway. I still hadn't called my mother. I told myself at various points that I would once there was something undeniable enough to say. I understand now that I was still quietly running the same math I'd always run, still building toward a total I could finally hand her. The difference was that this time I wasn't waiting for her permission to keep building it in the meantime. The invitation came from the Denver Metro Business Alliance, 8 weeks after Mercer & Co. crossed $2 million in annual revenue, a number I'd watched climb on a spreadsheet. The same way I'd once watched a restaurant's weekend sales creep back past a competitor's, except this time the spreadsheet had my own name on the header instead of someone else's. The award was for emerging business leadership, and the ceremony was black tie, held in a downtown hotel ballroom. I'd walked past a dozen times without ever once imagining I'd be standing inside it as anything other than a guest. I read the nomination letter 3 times before I fully believed it wasn't a mistake. Someone on the selection committee had apparently pulled Mercer & Co.'s client retention numbers as part of the review. 91% year over year, higher than most agencies twice our size, and had written a line in the letter I've kept since, built on unusually specific work, not volume. I taped that sentence inside my desk drawer, not the award itself, because it was the first piece of praise in years that had actually described what I did, instead of simply reacting to the fact that I'd done well. I had no idea my family would be there. I found out later that my sister's husband, Grant, worked for one of the event's major corporate sponsors, and that my mother had been invited as his guest, seated at a table near the front with a clear view of the stage. I wouldn't have known any of it in advance even if I'd asked, because by then I genuinely hadn't spoken to either of them in over a year. Ethan wore the one suit he owns, the same one from our own small courthouse wedding, 8 months earlier, an event my family hadn't been invited to, and that I'd never once regretted keeping small. We sat at a table near the back, with 2 of my earliest clients, Marisol and Ray, both of whom had insisted on coming, once they heard I was being recognized, both of whom I'd invited before I invited anyone else. Because they were the people who'd actually watched this get built from nothing. I heard my mother's voice before I saw her, 3 tables over, laughing at something. Grant had said a laugh I would have recognized anywhere. Because I'd spent 31 years learning to read its exact register. The specific pitch that meant she was performing comfort for an audience, rather than feeling any. I felt my chest tighten the way it used to at every family dinner, every holiday, every moment I'd once spent scanning a room to see where I ranked in it. Then, I noticed something had changed. The tightness passed within a few seconds. Instead of sitting there all night the way it used to, I had built something in the 2 years since that wedding that no longer needed her attention to feel real. The ceremony moved through several categories before mine. I watched other founders walk up to polite applause, thinking about very little except whether my hands were going to shake. When it was my turn, the same specific tremor I'd noticed once before, standing on a dark parking lot, holding an envelope I never asked for. They didn't shake, I noticed that, too, filing it away the way I file away every small data point that tells me something has actually changed instead of just feeling different in the moment. Founder and CEO of Mercer & Co., the presenter said. Lauren Mercer. I stood up. I didn't look toward my mother's table on the way to the stage. Not out of restraint, but because I genuinely wasn't thinking about her at all in that specific moment, which was its own kind of answer to a question. I'd been carrying for 2 years without realizing it. I was thinking about Priya, letting me take client calls in the back office of a cafe. I was thinking about Marisol's grandmother's recipes, and Ray crying in his own back office over sales numbers. I was thinking about a mattress on a floor and a spoon scraping the bottom of a pot. The applause, when I reached the podium, was a standing ovation. The kind that takes a beat to register as actually happening to you, and not to someone standing near you. I said a few sentences I'd prepared, mostly thanking Ethan and the small handful of clients who'd bet on me before there was any evidence yet that the bet would pay off. I did not mention my family. I hadn't planned that as a statement. It simply hadn't occurred to me, standing up there, that they belonged anywhere in the story I was telling. I found out what happened at my mother's table. Only because Chloe called me 2 days later, her voice tight in a way I'd never once heard from her growing up, when she'd always been the daughter allowed to sound however she wanted without consequence. She told me our mother hadn't said a word to anyone during the applause. She'd simply sat there, frozen, watching a stage she'd apparently never once imagined I'd be standing on. Then, once the applause died down and the next category began, my mother had turned to Chloe and asked her a single question, quietly, not unkindly, in the exact tone she used to use when she wanted an answer nobody else at the table could overhear. Why couldn't you build something like that? Chloe told me she didn't have an answer. She said. She sat there for the rest of the ceremony, unable to focus on anything else, turning that sentence over the same way I'd once turned over someone, like you, in a parking lot. 2 years earlier. Except she was turning it over from the opposite side of it. Understanding for the first time what it actually felt like to be the daughter suddenly found wanting, instead of the one who'd been protected from ever having to wonder. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that. It wasn't triumph, though I understand why people watching a story like mine might expect it to be. It was something closer to grief for both of us. My mother had spent decades building a hierarchy she apparently believed was load-bearing, something that would hold up her family's shape indefinitely, and it had taken a single sentence at an awards ceremony to reveal that the hierarchy had never once been about either of her daughter's actual worth. It had just been about which daughter required less of her to feel comfortable. My father called me a week later, alone, without my mother knowing. He apologized for something he'd never once apologized for in 31 years, for watching the favoritism happen, dinner after dinner, decade after decade, and never once saying anything. Not because he agreed with it, he told me, but because disagreeing with my mother had always cost more than he was willing to pay. I told him I appreciated the apology, and that I needed more than an apology to trust. It meant something different this time. He said that was fair. We've talked most weeks, since carefully, the two of us rebuilding something neither of us fully knows the shape of yet. Chloe's marriage, I learned slowly over the following months, had been quietly struggling under a different kind of pressure than mine ever was. A life built almost entirely around parental support and approval that had never once required her to test what she could build without it. When that support started to feel less automatic after the ceremony, she found herself without the muscle I'd been forced to build the hard way, in a 600-square-foot apartment above a laundromat. I'm not telling you that to say she deserved it. I'm telling you because it's the part of this story. People skip when they imagine revenge as satisfying, instead of simply sad on every side of it. My mother reached out 4 months after the ceremony, not with an apology exactly, but with something adjacent to one she told me. Over a phone call I let go, mostly silent on my end, that she had never actually believed I was incapable. She said she'd simply never taken the time to see what I could become without her steering it, and that watching me build something entirely outside her control had forced her to recognize a version of worth she'd never once thought to measure. I didn't forgive everything in that phone call. I haven't forgiven all of it since. What I did instead was set terms, the same clear, specific way I set terms with a client before I ever agreed to take on their account. I told her I was open to a relationship, cautiously, on the condition that it started from equal footing. No more quiet rankings, no more envelopes measured against ballrooms. I told her that earning a place in my life now meant treating both her daughters the same way. Consistently. not just in the room where I happened to be watching. Here's the closest thing I have to a lesson out of any of this, the one I'd actually want someone to take from it, instead of the revenge people expect. The people who decide your worth early rarely do it with malice. They do it with convenience. It is simply easier to rank your children, your employees, your own sense of who deserves investment, than it is to keep asking honestly whether the ranking still holds. If you're the one who got ranked low, the answer was never to prove them wrong. It was to stop asking the question at all and build the proof for yourself, on your own terms, whether or not anyone with the original ledger ever bothers to update it. I keep 3 things in my office now. My original business registration, creased down the middle from an apron pocket. My first real client check, the $2,800 that told me the pricing actually worked, and the award, still in its box most days, because I've never needed it displayed to remember what it meant. The $500 from the wedding. I never kept it. I didn't need a reminder of what my mother once thought I was worth. I'd already built the proof myself. If you've ever been the daughter, the son, the sibling who was quietly ranked lower for reasons nobody ever fully explained, I want to know what it took for you to finally stop asking for the reassessment and start building the proof on your own. Tell me in the comments where you are in that process right now. And if this one hit close to home, follow the channel, because next week's story starts with a locked storage unit and a rare coin collection nobody in the family remembered buying.